And Boyd Wiggum is on the phone from Cheyenne, Wyoming. Now, just so you know, Boyd, we just had a few days ago, we had Ted Nugent on the show. And that will bring half the ratings than having you on. Will, I'm sure it will. How have you been, Boyd?
Oh, I've been well. We're still
Okay.
trying to recover from the hangover of Cheyenne Frontier Days down here in Cheyenne.
Oh, that causes a hangover. What happens in Frontier Days that I'm missing?
Well, it just kind of slows down, and I think everything happens that you kind of expect might happen.
Okay. Yeah, well, you get a bunch of, Western folk together for that kind of a party, then, and so obviously I got to make some time for this. Okay, so what are you bringing us today, Boyd?
Well, one of the things that's emerging as an issue down here in Cheyenne and in Jackson, and probably something that I believe Gillette has recently faced, is housing shortages.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been trying to find a way to fix some regulations so people can build houses for workers to live in.
Okay, so let's be clear about, for those who are wondering what you mean by housing shortage. Wyoming goes through boom and bust periods, not just the entire state, but regions of Wyoming do. For example, Douglas, it looks like it's about to hit a boom there, and people need to start building houses. So does this mean that there's regulators in the way? Is that what you're telling us?
I believe that's one piece of the puzzle is that down here in Cheyenne, of course, we adopted a unified development code that not only says what you can do with your property, but what it has to, what any building you build has to look like. And somewhere along the line, Cheyenne's rental vacancy rate has dropped to unimaginably low levels.
Which means the rent is probably going up.
As in my shopping, it looks like the rent probably costs more than what it would cost to buy an equivalent house.
Well, you see, when I first moved out here, which was about 5 years ago, I hit Gillette, Wyoming, which is at the end of I was catching the tail end of a boom. And I was looking at a small, very small, Boyd, 1-bedroom apartment. And they wanted $1,500 a month for it. And I was asking the lady, what is this, like New York City? What do you mean $1,500 a month for this little place? Well, now it's come back down. It's still above what you tend to find around the country, but it's come down a lot since then. So if you guys are running out of apartments out there, is it just that it's that difficult to build an apartment that there's not enough around?
Well, it's the information I'm getting is that that's part of it. And there have been a few people that have tried, few developers, landowners who have tried to propose projects that would include apartments in the city and have gotten a lot of pushback from neighbors and from regulators in the city council. And one time we even had a situation where over half the city council voted to approve a rezoning, but Wyoming state statutes give 20% of your neighbors virtually a veto power over your ability to
so my neighbors can tell me what I can and can't do with my own property.
Exactly. Well,
okay.
anybody that has land within 140 feet of your property, if you're trying to get it rezoned, Wyoming gives them the power to petition and force the local government to have a supermajority vote to permit you to do it.
Well, see, now you and I are limited government thinkers, but I would think I don't mind so much if there's a few building codes to make sure that you're not building a place that's going to burn down.
And burn your neighbor's property down at the same time.
Yeah, some basic safety rules when you're building a house I can understand. If a neighborhood, if you decide to join a neighborhood that it's a coveted community, so you have to sign the covenant to get in, which sounds like you're joining like a witch's coven to me, but okay, watch out. It has about the same result if they get out of control. But all right, so you've signed it, so you've agreed to those extra rules. But in a free society, really, that's about the only place that there should be extra rules. So we have our local governments imposing them on us, in other words, at city council meetings.
Yeah, and that's part of it, and it's partly the state government. And I think that's coming home to roost here in Cheyenne is the local community down here has discovered that they have this veto power to prevent, some local property owner from building a fourplex on his property in the neighborhood.
Okay. You did mention, when you were naming different areas, you mentioned Casper, Wyoming, which we're also on this. My show is also on in KVOC in Casper, Wyoming. And I have read a few articles out of their local newspaper because they've been having a bit of a housing problem there. Now, is that mostly because of the state government or the city?
I haven't tracked down the Casper situation.
Okay.
And I'm not trying to say it's all local, because, as I understand it, the federal regulators have tried to prevent us from ever having another bad economic spell by trying to dry up credit a few years ago, and I imagine that's another piece of the puzzle. I mean, this isn't usually very straightforward. But I did mention Jackson.
Right. Okay.
And
let's go to Jackson.
Jackson is highly regulated.
Like the country song says, going to Jackson. So let's go there. Why are they so highly regulated? Is that city regulation?
It's city and county regulation. They've got, believe it or not, they have a limit on the maximum amount of floor area you can have inside of a dwelling.
Really?
They don't want people to build their houses too big or too nice.
Okay. Now, doesn't this just have the result? I mean, you'll hear the argument. If you don't like it, or you don't have to live here. So it doesn't just have the result of people still are moving to Jackson. They're just living further and further out, which creates the problem that a lot of people complain about, urban sprawl.
Or that, and we complain about the condition of our roads. We complain about how much money we have to spend on road maintenance in Wyoming, and traffic fatality rates, and all of that. Yeah, that's exactly right. And the quandary in Jackson is, they've got a limited amount of space. They've got hyper regulation, and they still need teachers, plumbers, electricians, and of course, unlike Cheyenne or Gillette, I think they probably have some house staff that we're not familiar with.
Well, okay, now I don't see these people ever getting it. I mean, I've had some problems with homeowners associations in the past, and there's two groups, Boyd, that I see that don't get it. First off, there are those people who run the city, in the case of Jackson, and despite the problems that they're causing, they just continue heaping on more regulations, and then they wonder why the town is dying. On the other hand, though, and I hate to hit you with two topics at once, but the other hand, though, I see the problem of all of the people who live in these communities who end up moving out because they can't take it anymore. But one thing they never did, they never showed up at the meetings to take on these idiots.
Yeah, and maybe even more important than showing up at the meetings is showing up at the voting booth.
Right.
Which is, we're in that time of year now.
Well, and for that matter, not even just showing up at the voting booth, Boyd, running for office themselves. These people will complain, but not run for office themselves, because you can complain, you can show up to the meetings, but some of these people just need to be rotated out.
Exactly.
Okay, let's head back to Cheyenne. Let's take up the state government side again here. It's going to happen faster than we think, Boyd. All of a sudden, we're going to be in another legislative session. Is there any sign on the horizon that anybody in Cheyenne gets it and will want to reduce some of these regulations, or do you see more coming our way?
I don't know that there's really an appetite to add more, but I haven't seen anything. I haven't seen anything that suggests that something like this neighborhood veto power is what I'm going to call it.
Right.
Is likely to get removed. Of course, I haven't asked anybody to do it either, but I guess that puts me at fault a little bit. But I don't right now in Wyoming. I don't see an appetite for trying to give people power to further reduce housing availability.
Right. Okay. For those just joining me, I'm talking to Boyd Wiggum. He's with Wyoming Liberty Group. And we're talking about a bit of a housing shortage problem in the state of Wyoming, mostly because of regulations. And that's where I'm going to go back to what I said to you just a moment ago, boy. It kind of bothers me because here we have in certain parts of Wyoming the potential of another boom, and economically that can stifle the state if they don't make a few changes. I mean, even a small town like Douglas, which could suddenly become a mid-sized town by Wyoming standards, well, people may end up just doing it somewhere else. Like I said, urban sprawl.
Yeah, and here in Wyoming, we're already no stranger to pretty massive commutes.
Yeah.
I've often heard stories of people living in Douglas or Glen Rock and commuting up to the mines up around Gillette.
You know what I find interesting? Oh, hey, I know people who live in over in Sheridan who come to Gillette, or live down in Buffalo and Casper who go to Gillette to work. But what's interesting to me is, Boyd, I don't know if you've ever thought of this. I see two competing ideas from the same group of people. On the one hand, I guess about sustainability.
Yeah.
You have a sustainability coordinator, the whole Agenda 21 thing and so on. Okay. And so we're supposed to build, according to sustainability, these tiny little communities with very few roads and a lot of sidewalks, and we save the planet if we all live close together. But correct me if I'm wrong, it seems like the same people that are coming up with the sustainability rules are the same people that are creating such rules that we can't even build next to each other and don't want to, and we end up spreading out. So they're defeating their own cause.
Yeah, I don't know if it's the same people or different people. Down here in Cheyenne, the folks that are generally opposed to apartments or other rental properties, generally are advocates for, wide open spaces. Let me do what I want with my property. I don't want to be in a crowded situation.
Mm-hmm.
But they seem to, object to Agenda 21, but then in order to protect their own open spaces, they basically insist on some of the same tools, limiting density, limiting the ability of private enterprise to build things, limiting the ability of landowners to try to make a profit off of the properties they bought.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not. The arguments aren't for sustainability. It's we want to protect our Western way of life, and in the end, you're stepping on somebody else's toes.
Okay, well, let's go ahead and take a look at the conflict, Boyd. On the one hand, we have a group, or let's say one homeowner who wants to be able to do what he wants to do with his own property. On the other hand, we have his neighbor who's really upset at the garbage, as he sees it anyway, that's dropping his property values. And that's where a lot of the conflict comes from when it comes to states writing regulations and cities and counties writing regulations. So besides going to your government to have regulations, put up to keep your neighbor duct tape from going out into his yard and messing up the place, what would you do?
Well, we've got a couple of things to keep in mind. One of them is if one person is doing things that are actually harming a neighbor's ability to enjoy their own property, to use their own property as they see fit, things that typically think of pollution or something like that, loud noise, those kind of behaviors. Of course, you can be neighborly and go ask for a change. But even before we had zoning, even before we had the Constitution, people had private property rights to prevent their neighbor from creating a nuisance, and courts still enforce those. That's in there, if it's something egregious, and then as I said, you can talk to a neighbor, and part of it is sometimes maybe my property value is really high because my neighbor is not making full use of their property.
Mm-hmm.
If I buy a house at the edge of town, that's just across the fence is a farm field, I have to accept the idea that for a while I'm going to have a high property value because I'm capturing some of the value of my neighbor's property because of the, being able to see the mountains or something like that without any houses in the way. But that doesn't give me the right to prevent the farmer next door from eventually, selling some land for housing or something like that. And so although that may decrease my property value, the property value I have in my own house, the property value I was getting really wasn't something I created on my own. That was
Right.
just something I was borrowing. That value was something I was borrowing from my neighbor by them because they were refraining
Right.
from doing the very thing I did do, which is build a house.
I'm talking to Boyd Wigram from Wyoming Liberty Group. And let me ask you this one final question, which while you were talking about that, it reminded me of something. The ability to tell your neighbor what he can and can't do with his own property also tells you who you can and can't sell your property to. And that may change while you own your property. I mean, let's say I owned a farm and a bunch of acreage, and I decided to parcel that off and make a subdivision out of it. Or if it was an industrial area, but that's sort of dried up, and I decided to, whether I'm selling it for business and it was residential or it was residential and, vice versa, you can actually go to your government and change the rules so now I can't sell my property for what I intended it for.
Exactly, and that is what the problem is here, and that is what I'm talking about at the state statute level. And that's what I'm talking about here in Cheyenne is either the rules changing, one neighbor changing the rules as applied to next door neighbor, or more likely what happens is one landowner buys their house knowing what the zoning for the property across the road is, but things change, and the owner across the road needs to get it rezoned so that they can do what they need to do to make a living, to make a profit, to put their land to the highest and best use, and that's where you find out whether or not your elected city council people really respect private property rights.
Well, now
and
the other
I would
side,
argue that private property rights, they kind of end. I mean, you buy as much property and as many property rights as you want, and if you didn't buy those property rights,
Well, now the other side of that, to play devil's advocate with you, might be that, okay, my neighbor has decided to take his nice farm and make it an industrial park. Well, my property was worth a lot of money when I had a chance to look at his farm, but now that it's an industrial park, my house is worth nothing.
Yes, but you didn't necessarily have a right to maintain that nice vista of a farm unless you paid him for it's called conservation easement or a view shed easement. I mean, you can buy the rights from your neighbor to prevent future development if you want to do it. And if you haven't purchased those rights from your neighbor, they're not yours.
Yeah. All right. Boy,
now
I got to go because I'm running up on the clock here. How do people get a hold of Wyoming Liberty Group and the interesting articles you write?
Well, we are at www.wyliberty.org, or else you can find us on Twitter and Facebook, and we look forward to viewership.
All right. Thank you, Boyd, as always.